Good morning. I'd like to call to order the June 22nd, 2022 meeting of the State Water Control Board. Before I read the rules for today's meeting, and and before I call the roll, I'd like to welcome our newest members to the board. We actually have a returning member, Mr. Bob Dunn. Thank you. Welcome. It's nice to have you back.
Thank you.
Nice to have your experience back on the board. And I'd like to welcome Scott Cameron. Welcome, and thank you for joining our crew.
Glad to be here.
So very quickly, the rules for today's meeting. Attendees may not erect any signage inside or outside the meeting room or building. Attendees are not entitled to be disorderly or disrupt the meeting from proceeding in an orderly, efficient, and effective fashion. Disruptive behavior may result in recess or removal from the meeting. Possession or use of any device that may disrupt the conduct of business is prohibited, including but not limited to voice amplification equipment, bullhorns, blowhorns, sirens, and other noise-producing devices, as well as signs or sticks, poles or stakes, or helium-filled balloons. All attendees are asked to be respectful of all speakers. Rules will be enforced fairly and impartially, not only to ensure the efficient and effective conduct of business, but also to ensure no interference with the business of the complex, its employees, and guests. Attendees wishing to record the proceedings are welcome to do so. However, you may not interfere with the business of the meeting, nor impede the view or participation of other meeting attendees and staff. No smoking is allowed unless in a designated outside space. This includes tobacco and e-cigarettes. No alcohol, fireworks, pyrotechnics, weapons, or any substances or items controlled by law are allowed. No firearms are allowed in the state's contracted spaces except for firearms carried by law enforcement officers or authorized security personnel. All violators may be subject to removal from the meeting facility. Anyone removed from the facility may not re-enter. Anyone who fails to comply with removal may be charged with trespass. Do I have to read the second page too, or is that, okay. So worried about that. Thought I had something new. So I'll begin by calling the roll, beginning on my left.
Scott Cameron.
Jillian Cohen from Falls Church.
Paula Jasinski, Richmond.
Heather Wood, Norfolk.
Ryan Tier, Springfield.
Robert Dunn, Chester.
Mike Rollband, Director DEQ.
Thank you. Our Attorney General.
Mike Jagels with the Attorney General's Office.
And Chris Bergen with the Attorney General's Office.
Thank you. We'll begin this morning with tab A, the minutes from our March 25th, 2022 meeting. I trust everybody's had a chance to take a look at these. Are there any comments from the board? May I have a motion to accept the minutes as presented? I'll second that motion. Thank you. Motion made and seconded. All those in agreement signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Minutes are approved. Thank you. Second item on the agenda, fast track regulations, would be tab B of your board book. Repeal Virginia Pollution Discharge Elimination System, VPDES permit, general permit for concentrated animal feeding operations, 9 VAC 25-191. Neil, good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is Neil Zarodka. I manage DEQ's Office of Land Application Programs. Your board books indicate that Betsy Bowles will be delivering this presentation. She's ill today, so I'm filling in for her. First item on your agenda, it relates to Regulation 9 VAC 25-191-10 at SEEK, which is the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System VIPD's general permit for concentrated animal feeding operations, and this is a fast-track action to repeal the regulation. Next slide. State water control law authorizes the issuance of permits for the discharge of treated sewage, industrial waste, or other waste into or adjacent to state waters, and it also authorizes the board to adopt rules governing the procedures with respect to the issuance of permits. 62-144-17 specifies the board's authority to regulate discharges of other wastes, of which animal manures are included in other wastes. Next slide. The State Water Control Board has the authority to administer the NPDES program within the Commonwealth, and as such, the program is called the VIPD's program. Operations that meet the federal definition of a concentrated animal feeding operation, CAFO, found in Federal Reg 40 CFR 122.23b must seek coverage under an NPDES permit if the operation has a point source discharge to surface waters. Next slide. A periodic review of this regulation was concluded in October of 2021. The public comment period was held from August 2nd, 2021 through August 23rd of 2021. We did receive one comment from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that supported the repeal of this regulation. And the result of the periodic review was to repeal this regulation. Next slide. So this general permit that's associated with the regulation has expired. There are no facilities or activities currently covered by this regulation. Concentrated animal feeding operations in Virginia are currently covered under either the VPA permit regulation, the VPA regulation and general permit for animal feeding operations and animal waste management. That's 9 VAC 25192. The VPA regulation and general permit for poultry waste management, 9 VAC 25-630, and the VIPD's permit regulation, 9 VAC 25-31. So owners of CAFOs that have a point source discharge to surface waters are required to obtain an individual VIPD's permit under the authority of the VIPD's permit regulation. Next slide. Does the board have any questions?
Being none, we proceed.
Next slide. The staff recommendation is that the State Water Control Board, 1, promulgate the proposal for public comment using the fast-track process established in Section 22-4012.1 of the Administrative Process Act for regulations expected to be non-controversial. The board's authorization also constitutes its repeal of the regulation at the end of the public comment period, provided that 1, no objection to use of the fast-track process is received from 10 or more persons or any member of the applicable standing committee of either House of the General Assembly or of the Joint Commission on Administrative Rules, and 2, the department does not find it necessary, based on public comments or for any other reason, to make changes to the proposal. And 2, to set an effective date 15 days after close of the 30-day public comment period, provided that 1, the proposal completes the fast-track rulemaking process as provided in Section 22-4012.1 of the Administrative Process Act, and the department does not find it necessary to make any changes to the proposal.
Any questions regarding staff recommendation? May I have a motion? Excuse me.
Madam Chair, I make a motion to accept the staff recommendations as presented.
Motion's made. May I have a second?
I'll second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda, tab C of your board book, overview of Chapter 356 of the 2022 Acts of Assembly. Morning, Angie.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I didn't get to say that before. Sorry.
I kind of rushed in here.
Good morning. My name is Angie Jenkins. I am the Policy Division Director for the Department of Environmental Quality. I was asked to speak with you briefly this morning to just set some context for some of the regulatory changes that are before you today. As you may know, during the 2022 session, the General Assembly passed legislation clarifying the roles of DEQ, the State Air Pollution Control Board, and the State Water Control Board. I'm going to highlight a few of those changes that you'll see and that staff will be presenting in regulations coming before you today. Specifically, what the legislation does, and as I think you may have heard, it clarifies that the role of the boards is, the State Air Pollution Control Board and the State Water Control Board is with respect to the promulgation of regulations. Enforcement and permitting are the purview of the Department of Environmental Quality, and this change in law makes the three citizen boards, air, water, and waste, consistent across the board. Because permitting is within the purview of the agency, the bill does set forth a specific process for requesting a public hearing and for granting a public hearing on a draft permit. That process is very similar, if not identical, to the process that we have today. It's just that the entire process would be before the agency. The legislation also adds a definition of controversial permits, so you'll see that in some places throughout the regulations coming before you today. A controversial permit is essentially a permit, in the water world, is essentially a permit for which a public hearing has been granted. And as I said, the criteria for the agency to grant a public hearing are the same as they would be today, which are significant public interest demonstrated by 25 or more individual requests, substantial issues in controversy, and requests for action that are not inconsistent with authorities under the State Water Control Board. With respect to those controversial permits, the legislation also adds a new process for the agency. Before the agency can take final action on a controversial permit, the agency must publish the summary of comments and response to comments, and then provide another public hearing for those who commented before to respond to the agency's summary. That is a new process and different from what we've had to date. And finally, with respect to those controversial permits, the bill also provides a requirement that the agency at regular meetings of the board update the board on any controversial permits pending before the agency, and at that time provide the board with an opportunity to comment to the agency. So those are the things I wanted to highlight for you. You'll be seeing staff coming up presenting several regulations before you today. While those regulations were here and open, they're going to go ahead and also be addressing these changes related to this legislation. As you can imagine, there are a number of regulations, a number of the board's regulations that are impacted by this bill. The Administrative Process Act provides a specific timeline by which we can get the non-discretionary changes in to implement the bill. So you'll be seeing some regulations today to address these changes, and then the bulk, I think, you'll see at your August meeting to make sure we meet our deadline. With that, take any questions?
Any questions for Angie? Thank you. It's a
Thank
great,
you.
great summary, thank you. Next item on the agenda will be tab D of your board book. These are the, I guess, final exempt regulatory amendments to incorporate changes to the Aquacon Policy Regulation 9 VAC 25-410. Final exempt action amendment conforming to 2022 legislation. Sarah, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. My name is Sarah Sievers, and I'm the Water Permits, Planning, and Monitoring Manager in the Northern Regional Office. Today, I'll be talking to you about the item underneath tab D. As mentioned, it is a final exempt action to address amendments to the Occoquan policy, which is located at 9 VAC 25-410. And the changes to this chapter 410 are in response to two bills that were passed in the 2022 General Assembly session. Next slide, please. So the Occoquan policy pertains to the Occoquan watershed that's located in Northern Virginia, and this policy was adopted in 1971. Now, this predates the Clean Water Act as well as the State Water Control Law. The purpose of the policy is to protect the water quality of the reservoir, which serves as a drinking water source for the population in Northern Virginia. Now, at the time that the policy was enacted, there was poor water quality in the reservoir, largely stemming from low-achieving sewage treatment plants. So the plan was to limit the number of sewage treatment plants to just 2 to 3, preferably 2, high-performing regional sewage treatment plants that would have to adhere to strict effluent limits. Also, discharges from major industrial discharges are not allowed. However, there are allowances for small industrial discharges. Additionally, single-family residential septic systems that are failing may also seek discharge permits. The policy also established a monitoring program to monitor the water quality of the reservoir as this policy was enacted. Next slide, please. So in response to Senate Bill 567, it directs the State Water Control Board to amend a specific portion of the regulation, specifically 9 VAC 25-410-20 G2. And in that section, to provide that a Virginia Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, or VIPDIS permit, can be issued to an existing sewage treatment facility that was constructed and operated prior to January 1st, 2001, that serves no less than 10 homes and no more than 25 homes, that also has a documented history of noncompliance and is not feasible to connect that facility to a publicly owned sewage treatment plant. Next slide. The other revisions proposed to Chapter 410 pertain to Senate Bill 657 that addresses the authority of the department. So where it's appropriate, revisions are made to change the word board to department to reflect that change in authority that will occur July 1st. Now, I forgot to have a question slide, so at this time oh, thank you. Somebody's watching out for me. So I'll take a pause before moving on to staff recommendation if there's any questions pertaining to changes before you.
Any questions for Sarah? You can proceed with staff recommendation.
All right, moving on. Staff requests that the State Water Control Board adopt these amendments to the Occoquan Policy 9 VAC 25-410 as final regulations, authorize their publication, and affirm that the board will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any interested persons at any time with respect to the reconsiderations or revisions.
Melissa, I forgot to ask you if there was anybody signed up to comment on this or speak about this.
No, we
No,
do
okay.
not have anyone.
Okay,
There may be some others later,
okay,
so I will let you know.
okay, thank you. Any questions with regard to staff recommendation? There being none, may I have a motion, please?
Madam Chairman, I move that we adopt and approve the DEQ recommendation.
Motion's been made. May I have a second?
Second.
Motion's been made by Mr. Dunn and seconded by Mr. Seeger. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. All those opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Williams,
Good morning, Madam Chairman, members
Next.
of the State Water Control Board.
let me, I got ahead of myself. Next item on the agenda is tab E of your board book, Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area Designation and Management Regulation 9 VAC 25-830. Welcome.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you so much. I'll wait for the PowerPoint presentation to load. Again, good morning, Madam Chairman, members of the State Water Control Board. My name is Justin Williams. I'm the Director of the Office of Watersheds and Local Government Assistance at DEQ within the Water Planning Division. Today, I have before you a regulatory amendment action related to statutory changes in the last General Assembly. This is in response to Chapters 356, 486, and 207 of the 2022 Virginia Acts of Assembly. Next slide. The first action is related to Chapter 356 of the 2022 Virginia Acts of Assembly, and as you've heard about already today, this is in regards to changes necessary due to the board bill. Specifically within this amendment, we are changing designations from board to department where appropriate, changing the definition of the board, and making corrections to the code references. As the board may recall or be aware, under this particular program, there is not any permits that are issued, so that element is not affected by the board bill within these regulations. Next slide. 2 additional statutory changes were made in addition to the board bill during the General Assembly. The other additional inclusions in this amendment are in response to Chapter 486, the 2022 Virginia Acts of Assembly. So therefore, we are amending 9 VAC 25-830 137A3 to add a requirement that effective July 1st, 2023, compliance directly related with on-site sewage system pump outs to be managed and enforced by the Department of Health in 17 localities. That includes the counties of Accomack, Essex, Gloucester, King and Queen, King William, Lancaster, Matthews, Middlesex, Northampton, Northumberland, Richmond, and Westmoreland counties, and the incorporated towns within those counties that operate their own CBPA program. That's a total of 17 localities. We have begun discussions with those localities, the Planning District Commissions, and the Department of Health with regards to this requirement to ensure that we're able to, that these localities will be able to transition those requirements at that date of July 1st, 2023. Next slide, please. The final additional statutory change that was made is in response to Chapter 207 of the 2022 Virginia Acts of Assembly. In this instance, there was a change related to the requirements for publishing the criteria and elements for the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act programs by localities to their websites. So in this response to this, we have amended 9 VAC 25-830-60 to add this requirement so that the localities will publish the criteria and elements as required. We have begun outreach and surveying with localities, many of which already have websites with this information, and we'll be providing assistance with additional localities who do not to implement this requirement. Next slide. The Attorney General's Office has provided concurrence that the board has authority to promulgate the amendments to 9 VAC 25-830 as proposed, and that the amendments are exempt from the requirements of Article 2 of the Administrative Process Act pursuant to Virginia Code 2.2, 4006 A4A. Next slide. Does the board have any questions?
Any questions for Justin?
Next slide. The staff recommendation is that the board adopt the revisions to 9 VAC 25-838 SEC as final regulations and affirm that the board will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any interested person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision.
Any questions with regard to staff recommendation? There being none, may I have a motion?
Madam Chair, I make a motion to accept the staff recommendation as presented.
I second the motion.
Motion's been made by Mr. Seeger and seconded by Mr. Cameron. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of the board.
Next item on the agenda is Virginia Stormwater Management Program Regulation 9 VAC 25-870. It's in tab F of your board book. Good morning, Ms. Davenport.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, members of the board. Nice to see you all again. So this next tab relates to 3 final exempt actions that are the result of 3 pieces of legislation that was adopted by the General Assembly during the last session. Next slide, please. The first bill is House Bill 1224, Virginia Acts of Assembly, Chapter 32. This piece of legislation directs the Water Control Board to adopt its regulations providing for the certification and use of a proprietary best management practice. We also call these manufactured treatment devices. A little closer? Sure. That's not usually a problem for me. Sorry about that. So the statute asks us to provide certification for the use of a proprietary best management practice if another state, regional, or national program has verified its nutrient or sediment removal effectiveness and it's having met or exceeded all of the program's established test protocol requirements. This bill is a little bit different than a lot of the ones that we see in that there was an emergency enactment clause, so it actually became effective on April 1st, 2022. As I think we have discussed before, you all have a 90-day window to utilize the final exempt action from the time a bill is signed to the time it goes to the Virginia Register. So that's the main reason that this one is before you, because we have a truncated time frame there. What we have proposing is a change to 9 VAC 25-870-65D, which is the section that talks about water quality compliance, and the addition is simply any proprietary BMP approved for use after July 1, 2020 must meet the requirements of 62.1, 44, 15, 28, A9 of the Code of Virginia, which codifies the basis of this amendment. Next slide, please. The second piece of legislation that relates to the changes in the stormwater management regulation is House Bill 184, Virginia Acts of Assembly, Chapter 160. This is a pretty technical bill in that, as you may recall, localities in Virginia either must administer a local Virginia stormwater management program or may choose to if they are not required to otherwise. And this legislation authorizes a locality that already administers a VSMP program or a Virginia Erosion and Stormwater Management Program to be the VSMP authority for a regional industrial facility authority if the locality is a member of that regional authority. So it just expands their authority to be a VSMP. And that's found in the provisions, the regulatory provision that's changed is 9 VAC 25-870-102. And then finally, next slide, please. The third bill that we are incorporating into this regulation, since it's open for those other two actions, are the requirements of Senate Bill 657, Virginia Acts of Assembly, Chapter 356. This is the legislation that limits the authority of the State Water Control Board to the issuance of regulations, and it transfers to the board's existing authority to issue permits and orders to DEQ. And finally, as both Angie and Justin mentioned, it provides procedures for public comment on pending controversial permits. So the changes that we made in summary to 9 VAC 25-870, including where appropriate, changing designations from board to department. We added the definition of board. We added the definition of controversial permit. We added the language establishing permit rationale, all of the elements that were in House Bill 657. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, these regulatory changes are being brought to you under the expedited adoption process. And that process is that reg may be exempt if it's necessary to conform to changes in Virginia statutory law or the Appropriation Act where no agency discretion is involved. And we have received certification from the Attorney General's office on this. Now, unlike Sarah, I do think I missed a questions page. Oh, you must have stuck it in too.
She's good.
Very good. And that's it for the proposed changes to the stormwater management regulation, if there are any questions.
Melanie, I do have one question.
Yes.
And it has to do with the, where is it? The Industrial Facility Authority. Prior to that, who administered the stormwater management program?
DEQ did.
DEQ did.
And in fact, we are currently in the process, I have shared with So this facility is located in Pittsylvania, which is a VSMP authority that DEQ manages. They would like the city of Danville to take on, and Danville is a member of the regional authority. So we've actually, in the process, we are in the process of getting a memorandum of agreement signed where all of those parties agree that Danville will review, sit in the seat as a VSMP authority for this regional industrial authority.
So is the definition of that, does that apply to what I know to be an industrial development authority? Is that the same?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Does it apply to what I know to be an industrial development authority or an IDA?
The actual language is a Regional Industrial Facility Authority, an RIFA, which I believe is something different than a Regional Economic Development Authority.
Yeah, industrial development authority.
It's more about that specific facility and the real estate and the activity that's going to happen on that facility.
Okay. Thank you.
Certainly.
Madam Chair, Mayor?
Ryan.
Ms. Davenport, can I have two quick questions? One, and I shuddered away to ask this. Do you know kind of what the rationale before the first change in terms of the requirement that the state adopt kind of the proprietary best management practice of certified by other states, kind of what the rationale behind that was?
Unfortunately, I do.
Okay.
And I say that because it's a bit of a long story. When the stormwater management program came to DEQ in 2013, there was a pending regulatory action to develop something called VTAP, which is the Virginia, I don't even remember what it stands for, but the idea that DCR and the Soil and Water Conservation Board were working on was that Virginia would develop its own certification program for these manufactured treatment devices. What was interesting, though, is that the reg action that came to you in process was what was known as a fast-track reg, which meant there was no controversy regarding the substance of that regulation. And guess what? There was a huge amount of controversy relating to how we would manage and regulate and authorize these manufactured treatment devices. So the State Water Control Board at the time repealed that action. So we were kind of left with, okay, how do we authorize these devices? The same time, well, I guess it was in 2014, there was a substantial change to the Stormwater Management Act, and the General Assembly added a requirement that we had to offer reciprocity to any manufactured treatment device that had been approved by anybody else. So it sounds kind of straightforward, but when you look at these devices, the two main testing programs are in New Jersey and Washington State. Washington State has very different precipitation patterns. Those programs are based on total suspended solids removal. Virginia is a phosphorus removal-based state. So we had to come up technically with an explanation for how are we going to evaluate reciprocity. So we adopted a guidance memorandum that we used for several years, and there's a lot of competition within the industry of manufactured treatment devices. So the year before last, legislation was passed that said, regardless of how DEQ is implementing this, we can only approve MTDs that have been verified and certified by another authority. Well, it turns out that there's actually a distinction between those two things. Verification is more the science behind the testing. You know, did you follow the test protocol, or your test results legitimate? And certification was more the action that the state took to say, okay, you can use this device for stormwater management in this state. And there were some facilities, some treatment devices that, this was particularly in New Jersey. New Jersey didn't certify it, but they verified the results. So they couldn't use it in Virginia. We were not authorized to let them use it because it wasn't certified. So this proposal was made, I think, again by the industry, and the General Assembly said, okay, we'll go. Verification is the technical guts of it, and that's sufficient for us. I'm sorry, it was a long story.
No, I appreciate that. But it does beg one more question in terms of, so to the extent that there are these two facilities that are doing the verification, and to the extent that there may be different priorities in different states in terms of what the pollutants they want to control with these devices, does this regulation basically say is if it's verified in a state, they may have TSS as its kind of underlying requirement for the technology, but like you said, for Virginia, it might be a phosphorus need. Verification for TSS is sufficient for the state to be able to use that device in this state, even if the state's priorities might be a different pollutant or a different standard.
Yes, but as we take that technical information and certify it for use in Virginia, we'll evaluate what that relationship is between TSS removal and phosphorus removal. Traditionally, it comes out at about 40%, but we take a look at that, and that's part of that back-end certification process. The other thing that might be of interest is the Water Environment Federation actually initiated kind of a national effort to provide a verification framework for all these manufactured treatment devices. And we have been, that has now moved to, I'm sorry, I can't remember, the Stormwater. It's another group out of DC, Seth Brown. I don't know if you know Seth, but we've been working with Seth. We've had an initial conversation with him. We are very interested in participating in whatever comes out at a national level, because this has been a challenge, and it's just been, it's something that takes up an enormous amount of staff time, because these certifications potentially give somebody an industry edge and a marketing edge. So we would love for somebody else to run this program.
Clarification for that. You said Washington State, New Jersey, and this program out of DC, I think, are participating in the certification. Is that right?
Both Washington State and the state of New Jersey currently have testing protocols. Okay. And then they do their own certification based on the verification that the unit has been through the appropriate protocols. And what I've been told is that what we're looking at a national level is sort of an ASTM standard for verification, and then states would be able to provide their certification based on however they do business in their state.
Okay. So somebody could approach you as DEQ saying, can you certify this?
Yes.
This process? Okay.
Yes. And as long as there's test data that we take a look at, and we've made that, translation is not the right word, but we've been able to look at the data and go from TSS to phosphorus. And we've been traditionally really conservative in the removal efficiencies that we grant these devices. And let me say, I think you should be thankful that we didn't go through a regulatory action on this one.
Yep. Any other questions or comments from the board?
If there are none, the staff recommends that the board adopt the amendments to the Virginia Stormwater Management Program Regulations, 9 VAC 25870, as amended and presented to you today. And secondly, the staff also recommends that the board affirm it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsider or revision of this regulation as provided by the Administrative Process Act.
Any questions regarding staff recommendation? May I have a motion, please?
Madam Chairman, I move we adopt the staff recommendation as presented.
Motion's been made. May I have a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mr. Cameron. Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda, tab G of your board books. Certification of non-point source nutrient credits, 9 VAC 25-900. Melanie.
If I may, we are proposing 3 final exempt actions regarding the certification of non-point source nutrient credits regulation. And again, these result from 3 actions taken by the Virginia General Assembly during its 2022 session. Melissa, may I have the next slide, please? So the first bill is Senate Bill 187, Virginia Acts of Assembly, Chapter 526, and it relates to the conditions under which DEQ is being authorized to release stream nutrient credits on an accelerated schedule. We currently have language in the regulation that you all adopted not too long ago about when a schedule for credit release. And the purpose of this legislation was to allow us to accelerate the release of credits that are generated by a stream restoration project. And what the legislation does is it calls out 3 factors that we are to consider in releasing credits earlier than what's currently in the regulation. The first is a determination that the level of risk is low. The second is the provision of additional financial assurance. And then the third element is the experience of the applicant. What's interesting about this legislation is even though we are bringing to you this regulatory adoption, the provisions of this bill do not become effective until 30 days after the department issues guidance regarding the implementation. So as I read those factors, you may have all thought, how are you going to determine if the risk is low and the experience of the applicant? Well, that's what we will be doing as we develop guidance. So we're asking that this reg change be authorized, but it will not be effective until we generate that guidance. The second amendment, if I may, relates to Senate Bill 187, Virginia Acts. Oh, next one, please. Sorry. The second one relates to Senate Bill 188, which relates to nutrient credit stream restoration projects and the use of third-party long-term stewards. The current regulation requires that demonstration of financial assurance. So maybe I should step back a little bit. When we authorize these nutrient credit banks, the credits that are generated are utilized by new development projects. So rather than putting in a stormwater MTD or building a stormwater basin or whatever kind of treatment might be necessary, developers can purchase these nutrient credits. These are a little bit different than point source credits in that they have to be perpetual because they are offsetting development. So going along with this certification of credits and release of credits is we require financial assurance such that these projects remain as they're supposed to be operating because folks have already benefited from the credit reduction. So we have been pretty focused in terms of what these financial requirements are, and currently the regulation requires use of a trust fund in order to demonstrate financial assurance. What this legislation does, it says as an option to that trust fund, we can allow the use of third-party long-term stewards to hold and manage that long-term management fund. So for example, it's kind of confusing. It's hard to explain. So you have a landowner who perhaps undertakes a land use conversion. They take cropland, they take it out of production, they plant trees. Really, their only involvement is that they are the landowner. They have executed a lease with the folks who are going to manage this project for them. So those long-term management stewards would be the folks who would be managing the fund. And in fact, there is it's usually a deed of restriction. So there's legal documentation that's filed in court, and those folks will be responsible for that long-term maintenance. And I'm honestly not an expert on the market and mechanics of what these bank developers do, but they approached the General Assembly about making this option in addition to a trust fund. And the General Assembly passed this legislation. So there are 3 places in the regulation, 230C3, 270A, and 280B, where there are references to these financial assurance requirements and allowable mechanisms, and they have all been amended to allow the third-party long-term steward to hold the management fund.
I have a question about that.
Yes, Madam Chair.
So, basically, the landowner has a contract with a long-term management
Yes.
company. What happens if there's a breach of that contract or that I mean, what's considered long-term, like 50 years?
Perpetual.
Perpetual, so perpetual, okay.
Then
But
that's
what
what
if
the
there's a breach of that contract or a break in that contract?
The way, well, I guess it sort of depends on what the breach is, but because there is a contract, there is a lease, and there is a an entered deed of restrictions. But the way we think about it, for example, if somebody all of a sudden said, you know what, I want to cut all these trees down. Now, they are allowed to timber. They can have a long-term timber plan, and then you let the trees grow back. But if they say, okay, we want out of this, one of the things that the financial assurance covers is if, for example, you had a nutrient bank, say it sold 50 credits, and then the owner says, oh, I want out of this business. Part of the financial assurance is to make sure that they could then purchase, the bank operator could then purchase those credits somewhere else, so they could kind of offset it, and then there'd be a whole legal dispute among the parties. We just want to make sure that there are enough credits to offset the development that occurred. And then a lot of that is just left to the
And
market
those
among
are-
all those parties, right?
Those are perpetual and there's a deed of trust or.
Right. And the rub, of course, is that the people, the entities that purchase the credits, purchase them as part of compliance with their construction general permit, which once they've completed construction, we don't have a permit over them anymore. I do have to say, we've been doing this for, I believe DCR's original guidance was in 2008, and I'm not aware, we haven't had any problems, so keep your fingers crossed.
Paula?
Hi, I just had a follow-up on that. For the use of these third-party stewards, what's the verification process? And maybe I'm missing that part, or you're going to get to it. So to verify that these nutrients are actually, there's a B&P in place to actually manage them as promised.
Well, the vast majority of the current non-point source nutrient banks are a land use conversion, where they have taken land out of crop production or hay production and planted trees. And there are monitoring intervals. Well, first of all, we do an inspection. We document that the property was in fact in ag use at a certain date, because we want to make sure we're actually resulting in a net nutrient input to the system. We inspect on a regular basis. They have to submit monitoring plans to us. There are monitoring requirements in the certification, and they submit those reports to us on a regular basis. And then, we can look, these are actually pretty cool to track with satellite imagery, because it's very obvious that there is still a large forest there, as opposed to a subdivision, or if it's gone back to cropland. So we do watch it all. The other tool that is often used is stream restoration projects, and we do the same thing. We can again track those by satellite. We have monitoring requirements and submittals to us. We will do spot inspections. So it's not like, it's not the installation of those discrete ag BMPs. It's a much more permanent land use change.
just two quick questions. One on the second change. Question on the enforcement side. So assuming, all things go bad, is the enforcement the contract violation, or is the enforcement at the DEQ level in terms of, okay, so you have an offsetting credit for a permit, so therefore you've, in essence, alleviated a permit responsibility to do the mitigation credit, correct? Which is the enforcement? Would DEQ be the enforcer?
I would say it depends.
Okay.
In that we would be enforcing the financial assurance mechanism. I don't know that you all are aware, but we have a group that resides in our Land Protection Division that are the subject matter experts on financial assurance mechanisms. I think they have a safe that's full of all these documents. So we work with those folks in terms if we have to enforce and get paid out on a financial assurance mechanism. Needless to say, there have been a few instances in other programs, not this program, where there has been insufficient funds, usually ends up at the Attorney General's office.
Thank you. And my second question is on the first change in terms of the early release. It's not entirely clear. Can the release of credits be before the credits are constructed in any situation?
No. The way it is, and Alan, if I say anything wrong, please jump up. It is a graduated release of credits. And what this does is, there's always a percentage that's held for further maturation of a project, and that is what this legislation was crafted for, to let us release a little bit sooner than what's the normal maturation schedule.
I think the only reason I asked the question is because yes, it lays out in the regulation that there's the ability to do a release schedule based on time and implementation, but then you say more generically, but you can do early release if you meet these two criteria. But what you're saying to me is, but in no instance can you release a credit before the credit is constructed.
For land conversions, we release 25% at approval. Is that right? I'm sorry, Alan, I can't keep all these numbers in my head.
Right, on the stream restoration projects, they are traditionally released 25% upfront when the project is constructed, and then an additional 25% each year where you have a bank full event and the bank has, and the structure has held up. So if you have bank full events, you can get 100% release over a 4-year period. This would allow a 50% release in that first year. So you get your full 100% over a 3-year period. Kind of front loads the project a little bit so they can sell a little more credits up front to help finance the project. And it will only be done on like lower risk projects higher in a watershed on smaller streams where you have the additional financial assurance as well as a track record.
So I apologize for being kind of dense on this, but even if that is the case, so the only kind of question I just want to know is, but even if it says early release, you still have to have the actual restoration work in the ground before
Yes.
there can be a release of that
That's
credit
correct.
for that work.
That's
Okay,
correct.
great.
For stream also.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One more question related to that,
Yes.
please, and then I
Should
promise I'll
Alan's-
let you get to
should
the third
Alan's-
one. No,
should-
you don't need Alan, I don't think.
Could I
don't
just add
think,
a
but,
clarification, though? Chairman? One clarification, just so you don't get confused. In other programs, we do release 15% upfront project construction. So for stream restoration, same type of project, but for mitigation under 404 and 401, we do allow that.
Thank you.
Sure.
You made the comment that this would be effective 30 days after the guidance was issued. What's the schedule for the guidance?
I have not seen a first draft, so it's a bit out. And then remember, when we propose guidance, it has to go out for a 30-day public notice and comment period. So I wouldn't expect it before the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly.
Any other questions? I think you've still got
There's
one more
one
to go
more,
through,
yes,
don't
sir.
you?
Yes, ma'am, sorry.
That's my fault.
And
I
that
interrupted you.
is Changes related to Senate Bill 657, which is Virginia Acts of Assembly 356. This is the legislation that Angie described to you that we discussed in the VSMP reg amendments. What's interesting is that this is not a permitting regulation, but even so, there were plenty of references to DEQ and board, and you kind of had to sort it all out. So this legislation simply implements that change of authority that we all discussed from Senate Bill 657. And for example, one of the changes is that there's a definition, for example, of a Virginia water protection permit. And it says it means an individual or general permit issued by the board, which has been changed to the department. So it's just cleaning up those various references. And with that, I believe it's my questions. Oh, no, sorry, again, it's the process, final exempt. The APA allows for an expedited process, expedited adoption process if certain criteria are met. The primary is that there's no agency discretion involved, and the Attorney General's office has certified that this action is consistent with the expedited adoption.
Are there any other questions from the board?
I've got one question.
Scott?
Thanks. Melanie, on the First Amendment, the determination that the level of risk is low, I presume that's the level of risk of failure of the stream restoration project?
That and also size, location, if there is a failure, what would the impact be? If it's small, there's, likely there are fewer credits involved in the release. If it is up more headwaters, the hydrology is such that it's less likely to wash out. We're going to have to evaluate both a lot of the physical factors that go into approving a stream restoration project.
And would DEQ be making that determination, or DCR in conjunction with DEQ?
We will. We have a number of stream restoration experts on staff, both in this program and, as Director Rolban mentioned, for our 404 stream mitigation banks.
Any other questions? Staff recommendation.
Certainly, the staff recommends that the board adopt the amendments to the certification of non-point source nutrient credit 9 VAC 2590 as amended and presented to you today. And then secondly, staff recommends that the board affirm it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision of this regulation as provided by the Administrative Process Act.
Any questions with regard to staff recommendation? There being none, may I have a motion, please?
Madam Chair, I move that we accept the staff recommendation.
Motion's been made. May I have a second? Second. Motion's been made by Mr. Cameron and seconded by Mr. Dunn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next item on our agenda is tab H of your board books, final regulations, general permit for use of the superficial aquifer in a groundwater management area, 9 VAC 25-920. Mr. Grist. Hi, Joe, welcome.
Good morning, Madam Chairman and members of the board. I am Joe Grist. I am the program manager for the Water Withdrawal Permitting and Compliance Program within the Office of Water Supply of the Water Planning Division. Before you is the final general permit regulation for use of the irrigation withdrawals from the superficial aquifer, greater than 300,000 gallons in any month, again, 9 VAC 25-920. Next slide. Brief background on this, the Groundwater Management Act of 1992 replaced the Groundwater Management Act of 1973. So the current statute requires permits for withdrawal of 300,000 gallons or more of groundwater in any month in a groundwater management area. And we have two groundwater management areas. We have the Eastern Virginia Groundwater Management Area, which is primarily those areas east of Interstate 95 to the Chesapeake Bay and Atlantic Ocean. and then the Eastern Shore Groundwater Management Area, which encompasses Accomack County and Northampton County on the Eastern Shore. The statute and the regulation, Chapter 610, does not establish a predetermined aquifer priority for specific end users of groundwater. So in practice, DEQ utilizes a first-come, first-serve approach and does not require use of specific aquifers unless the aquifer requested by an applicant is fully allocated. Next slide. So Senate Bill 673, it addressed to the State Water Control Board that the impacts of non-agricultural irrigation on confined aquifer systems by prospectively prohibiting the use of these aquifers unless the quality and quantity of the surficial aquifer is insufficient for the proposed beneficial use. There is a notable non-potable groundwater use from the confined aquifer system currently for such uses as golf courses, community green space. This would create a new general permit to promote the use of the surficial aquifer for non-agricultural withdrawals in any of the two groundwater management areas. Next slide. The regulatory process that we have followed, the notice of intent for regulatory action was published back in November of 2020. And then we had a technical advisory committee in 2021, which met 5 times. The board authorized the public comment period and the public hearing for this proposal on December 14th of 2021. The Office of Attorney General completed its review and said the amendments are exempt from Article 2 of the Administrative Process Act. The draft final exempt regulation was published in the Virginia Register on February 14th of 2022. We held 2 public meetings, one on March 8th, 2022 in the Eastern Shore, and the other one on March 9th, 2022 in New Kent County. Each meeting was in one of the 2 prospective groundwater management areas. The public comment period was from February 14th through April 15th, 2022. Staff only received 2 public comments through the town hall, both in support of the recommended adoption of the general permit, and we received no comments during either of the in-person public meetings. Next slide. We'll briefly cover a couple of the sections of the general permit. Section 40, I just want to make note of here, delegation of authority we have amended. It was amended because the delegation of authority has now been removed since the authority is now statutorily vested in DEQ. Next slide. Section 70, reasons to deny coverage. Now this section provides criteria to deny applications for coverage under the general permit. Reasons to deny coverage include it's outside the groundwater management area, it's an activity in an aquifer other than the surficial aquifer, or it's an activity that causes or may reasonably be expected to cause or contribute to water level declines in an underlying confined aquifer system, or degradation of water quality, stream or wetland hydrology, or other in-stream beneficial uses. Next slide. Section 80 is exclusions. The department will determine the quantity or quality of the groundwater in surficial aquifer is not adequate. That'll be based on information provided to us by the applicant. However, it is required that if this is, if they want to do this withdrawal and it is greater than 300,000 gallons in any month, and they have provided information for us to determine the surficial aquifer isn't adequate, they would still have to apply for an individual permit under Chapter 610 to withdraw water from a confined aquifer. Next slide. Application process. This is a fairly standard process. It includes many of the elements of an individual permit, but not all. We tried to streamline this as much as possible to promote the use of the general permit process. So where we could, we took out elements, or we just streamlined it down and cut it back. So the primary elements in this still include a local government form that they are basically in compliance in their local government ordinances, the documentation of what their actual water volume need is, a geophysical borehole log about the actual well itself, the production well, and its plans to mitigate where it may be required. And also, it does include where the application can be administratively withdrawn for failure to submit information in writing back to DEQ within 60 days. Next slide. For general permit, this section basically is the reporting requirements. Instead of reporting quarterly as we do with individual permits, they would just be reporting to us annually their monthly readings. It does include a water conservation and management plan, very specific, basically a annual auditing plan, and a mitigation plan if the automated online system that we are providing the applicants for determining their area of impact, if it does extend off of the property itself. Next slide. Any questions of the board?
Any questions for Joe? Scott?
What's a minimal water level decline? How do you recognize that when you see it?
It would be, Scott, it may need on that particular. Oh, right, sorry. Yeah, so under beneficial use portion, let's see, I'm gonna get back to the slide you referred to.
The section 70 slide.
Yep, I'm with you. So this would be basically where we determine through our evaluation that is causing some type of a water level decline. In the superficial itself, let's say it has a situation where in the superficial it's a decline that may impact, let's say, wetlands nearby or some other impact to, let's say, residential nearby. We have a lot of residential wells that are actually in the superficial aquifer, a lot of shallow wells. So it would basically be a determination through our evaluation that it's going to cause some type of other issue. So.
Okay, so it's based on the impact to potential other uses in the area as
Yes.
opposed to 1 centimeter or 1 foot.
Right.
Got it.
Looking at impacts. Okay. Keep going.
I
if you want.
can't, my screen is off over there.
Any other questions?
They're working
Are they
on
working
trying
on
to
that?
get it
Okay,
fixed in the back. So you do have your handouts, or you can turn around, and there is a
can turn
screen behind
I
you.
can turn
but
around.
It is actively being worked on.
I just didn't know if you knew that was. Any other questions for Joe? You can proceed with staff recommendation.
Sure. Staff recommends that the board approve the general permit regulation 9VAC 25-920 and affirm that the board will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any interested person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision.
Any questions regarding staff recommendation? There being none, may I have a motion, please?
Madam Chair,
Ryan?
I make a motion to adopt the recommendations of staff as presented.
I will second that motion. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda are proposed regulations. Reissuance of Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System General Permit for non-contact cooling water discharges of 50,000 gallons per day or less, 9 VAC 25-196. It's in tab I of your board book. Mr. Ryan.
Morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. Again, this is a proposed General VIPI's permit regulation for non-contact cooling water discharges of 50,000 gallons per day or less, 9 VAC 25-196. This is a reissuance. Closer, is that better? Hey, I can hear myself now. Hold on. This is a reissuance of an existing permit. The current one expires March 1st of 2023, and we're going through our normal reissuance process. Next slide. Our NORA was published on October 12th of 2020. We received requests for TAC participation and one comment from the town hall website. And then we held our TAC on August 9th of 2021. We only had one meeting. And next slide. As far as significant changes proposed, we are revising the board definition for Senate Bill 657, which we've mentioned multiple times today, passed during the 2022 General Assembly session. That includes the definition section for board, the repealing of the delegation of authority section, and then going through the permit itself and deciding where board or department is more appropriate. We're also updating the Code of Federal Regulations publication referenced by the regulation. That's just updating the date to the most recent version. And we are updating the effective date of the permit to align with quarterly monitoring. So again, this one expires currently on March 1st. This permit has quarterly monitoring, so we will be having this one reissued on April 1st, which extends the current version of the permit for about 30 days. Next slide. We are also updating the authorization to discharge section in order to exclude facilities that are subject to federal regulations at 40 CFR 125, subparts I or J. Those deal with 316B of the Clean Water Act. The substantive provisions of those federal regulations apply to facilities that have surface water intakes that are greater than 2 million gallons per day and that use 25% or more of their intake flow for cooling, or exclusively for cooling. So any facility that is eligible for this general permit will fall below at least one of those thresholds. If they meet both thresholds, they would have to get an individual permit to deal with those issues there. So under this permit, they would not meet those thresholds, and so this addition to the authorization to discharge section simply clarifies that up front. In the registration statement section, we did add some requirements because even though they won't be meeting the thresholds and the federal regulations, we still have to deal with 316B. And so we're adding, I'm gonna just read it, a better way to do it. So 316B of the Clean Water Act requires that cooling water intake structures reflect the best technology available for minimizing adverse environmental impacts, dealing with impingement and entrainment of aquatic organisms. Federal and state regulations indicate that best technology available requirements for facilities subject to this permit regulation are to be established on a case-by-case best professional judgment basis. So we've added a number of things for the registrants to send their information in so we can make those case-by-case determinations. We also added the SEC number requirement for facilities that are required by law to have one, and we added some requirements for e-reporting. Once those get sent for e-reporting, we give them, I believe it's a 30-day notice, or a 3-month notice before that becomes effective. And then finally, we are updating the effluent limitations section in the permit simply to reflect the water quality criteria for chlorine instead of it just saying non-detect as it currently does. Next slide. Any questions?
Any questions for Joseph? You may proceed with staff recommendation.
Thank you. Number 1, staff recommends that the board authorize a public comment period and a public hearing for amendments to the general VIPT's permit for non-contact cooling water discharges of 50,000 gallons per day or less, 9 VAC 25-196. And 2, staff recommends that the board authorize the staff to serve as hearing officer at the public hearing.
Any questions with regard to staff recommendation? There being none, may I have a motion, please?
Madam Chair, I move that we adopt the staff recommendations as presented.
Motion's been made by Ms. Jazinski. May I have a second?
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you,
Thank you.
Joseph. Next item on the agenda, proposed regulations, local and regional water supply planning, 9 VAC 25-780. Mr. Cudlis.
I think it's still morning. Good morning, Madam Chair,
It
members
is
of the
for
State
another
Water
11
Control
minutes.
Board. As mentioned, my name is Scott Cudlis, and I manage the Office of Water Supply, and I'll be presenting the proposed amendments to the local and regional water supply planning regulation. which are located in tab J of your board book. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little background context to the proposed amendments, particularly since a number of you probably are not all that familiar with this program. The program really came about as a result of two primary things. The first is we experienced a drought of record, a prolonged drought from 1999 to 2002. And then the second thing that influenced the development of this particular bill in the legislature was the failure of a major local and regional water supply project to successfully obtain its permits. So those were the two factors that led to the development of this program. And the legislation was adopted in 2003, and by 2005, the regulations were on the street, and we were working with localities to implement them. The plans were submitted and reviewed by DEQ over the period of 2008 to 2013. And the data that was included in those plans provided the material for DEQ to develop its first state water resources plan, and that was published in 2015. As a result of that first state plan being put out, the legislature took an interest, and the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission conducted a study of DEQ's water resources planning and management programs and issued their report in 2016. And that report has some direct bearing in the genesis of the particular bill that these amendments are addressing. Basically, the three primary findings of that report were that the plans that were developed that were submitted as regional plans under the regulation that was current at the time were not regional enough. They characterized them as compilations of individual local plans, and they wanted to see them be more integrated. The second thing was that there was not enough participation in the development or comment process for these plans that were developed at the local and regional level. So they wanted to require that more activity take place to ensure that that occurred. And then the final thing was that the General Assembly or through the Audit and Review Commission didn't feel that some things that they thought were water supply risks were adequately spelled out as requirements in the regulation, nor was it clear that the expectation in the regulation was that each of those risks should be accompanied by an actual strategy for how to address it going forward. So those were the three primary findings, and that formed the basis for the bill that ultimately we're responding to. Next slide, please. So that statutory change was Chapter 1105 of the 2020 Acts of Assembly, otherwise known as House Bill 542. So that was the basis for initiating our NORA, our Notice of Intended Regulatory Action. This is a first for me. While we were meeting with the RAP, the legislature chose to pass some additional legislation that would affect the action that we were working on at the time. And so we did take the opportunity to address those two additional statutory changes during our RAP process. Chapter 331 of the 2022 Acts included some authorization and some criteria for how a locality might change its water supply region. And then 356, you've heard Angie talk about, and we refer to that as the board bill, the one that impacted your authority. So you will see those changes also included in the proposed regulation. So we did issue that NORA in June, on June 7th of 2021. We did receive 5 comments, and the comments were simply recommending individuals to participate on the panel that developed the regulation. We were responsive to 5 of those recommendations. However, we did not put one of the individuals on the RAP because it would have imbalanced the representation from a particular region, and our interest was in trying to create balance and not overly represent one area over another. The RAP convened and met 6 times, concluding their work on April 6th of 2022, and the result of their work is what's before you today. Next slide. So people always want to know, well, who was on the RAP? So this is the list of RAP members. We had a reasonably large RAP. It included 25 members. And as you can see by the representation here, that it includes a very broad cross-section of individuals and organizations who have a direct interest in the water resources of the Commonwealth and using those resources for water supply for whatever beneficial use they represent. One thing I would note that, interestingly enough, only one individual that was involved in the initial RAP was available to participate in the process. Most of them have moved on and retired, and so we did not have much benefit of continuity from the first action, which complicated things a little bit because some of the negotiated outcomes of the language that existed in the regulation, people had an interest in relitigating some of those issues, which we did work through, though. Next slide, please. So the most important thing that the bill did and the statutory change did was it actually requires that DEQ develop, well, actually the State Water Control Board, identify regional planning areas by regulation and to assign each locality to one of these planning areas. And so a major portion of the proposed reg in front of you includes the listing of every local town, city, or county in the Commonwealth and assigns them to one of 26 proposed regional planning areas. Currently, you can see in the smaller inset box there what we received in the first go-around, and that was actually 48 plans, 38 of which called themselves regional, and 10 individual plans because you were allowed to do that at that point. So we went through the process of establishing some criteria as a regulatory advisory panel and actually reaching out to individual localities and soliciting their input on the proposed regions and what their view was on those. So the criteria that we used referred primarily to the criteria that were in the statutory change, and that was first that they be primarily river basin based, so they be hydrologically based. And then the second thing that the statute said we had to consider, and that's to the extent possible, is any existing relationships that might already exist in the form of water purchase agreements or customer arrangements and those kinds of things. So the RAP agreed to supplement those with let's look at existing boundaries like planning district commissions, since they played a significant role in the initial process, and whether or not the localities shared a common source of water supply. And then the final thing that we asked them to consider was the manageability. There was a concern on the locality side about, well, a lot of our localities don't get along very well, and so we want to minimize the number that are planning together so we have some chance of succeeding in coming up with an integrated plan. And then our staff at DEQ has been reduced by 60% since we did the first plans. And so there's a manageability component there so that we could continue to be responsive and provide the technical assistance that they've come to expect in the development of these plans. So that's why we went from 48 to 26. So I really want to commend the RAP for actually doing a lot of that legwork, and I think it resulted in what I think is a manageable and a reasonably smart list of different groupings of locality that should help with this planning process going forward. Next slide, please. So if you prefer the list instead of the map view, these are the localities that are assigned to each region. Next slide. The other thing that moving from what used to be primarily an individual plan with regional incentives or incentives to regionalize to one that was strictly regional in nature required that we make a whole lot of changes throughout the regulation in terms of content, responsibility, and just nomenclature. And so you'll see that throughout Section 9 VAC 25780-50, which was the previous section that kind of went into all the details about how do you submit a plan, what has to be included, all of those kind of things. So now what it does is it differentiates. Localities have to develop information that's similar to what they developed before. They bring that information to the regional planning unit, and then it defines in detail what the regional planning unit does with that information and how it's characterized in the plan. So lots of changes, many of which aren't very significant, but I think they represent lessons learned from the process and try to address things that came up in the RAP. We think it's an improvement. It does maintain the 5-year review cycle and the 10-year resubmission cycle, but it also adds some specificity in terms of how those are conducted. You know, there's a timeline for when you're supposed to start it before it expires and things like that. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the other primary thing that the legislature wanted to see in the statutory change was greater stakeholder and public participation, and some of those changes were made in those procedural requirements in Section 50, but there's also an entirely new section, Section 55, that was developed explicitly to outline what the milestones and expectations are for the local public comment process. And that process is kind of a DEQ process that we might undertake for a permit, complete with public hearings and meetings and the collection of comment and response to comments. It's a significant step forward in terms of being very clear about what the expectation is locally. The other thing that the changes in Section 50 do is that it requires that the regional planning unit submit to DEQ basically a proposal about what their process will be for including stakeholders and getting their input. And so that's another significant change. It also requires that there be a kickoff meeting to initiate the process so that all processes are starting in a reasonably concurrent fashion, and that the proper people are invited. So that's another significant change. We can move on to the next slide. Next slide. There we go. All right. And then the third major area, as I mentioned, is the identification of water supply risks and regional strategies that are required. This is a brand new section, 9 VAC 25-780-125. And this is specifically to address that change in the statute. In addition, in section 30, there is a definition of water supply risk, and this was very important to the water suppliers that were on the regulatory advisory panel, because you know, they have an idea of what water supply risk is, and it's close to the idea the DEQ had going in, but it's not exactly the same. So we worked and crafted a definition that I think everybody got behind. But basically what it is it's a future circumstance or event that may reasonably impair the ability to meet current or projected water demand. And it goes into some detail about what it also is not. And it's not a minor, infrequent, or temporary interruption that may be remedied through normal operation and maintenance, or it's an event that, or circumstance that is not reasonably foreseeable. So it's either short-term or not likely to be foreseeable. So next slide, please. And continuing in this section, it requires that there's a basic set of risks that all regional plans need to address. There was a lot of discussion about this, and this is one area where there were some concerns at the end. There's a subset of the regulatory advisory panel that preferred seeing just an open-ended directive in the regulation for them to assess and decide what risks existed. And DEQ decided and negotiated in the RAP process that, yes, we want that flexibility, but we also think in order for this to be successful, there's a minimum level of risk that people should at least consider and take a look at. So that's included. Both elements are included in the proposed reg. It requires, as I said, consideration. It doesn't presume up front that every region actually has that specific list of risks. So that was kind of the compromise that we ended up with. It also, as I said, requires the identification and evaluation of a reasonable range of potential regional strategies or individual projects, water supply development projects, to address those risks that are identified in the plan. Okay? Next slide, please. So there are some other changes, and I'll just touch briefly on these. The first change, I'm not going to go into much detail in. It looks pretty self-explanatory, and you've heard several presentations so far, including Angie's, about what this change means. We went through and changed board to department in every location except the portion about designating through regulation the regional planning areas. That will remain a state water control board decision because it's regulatory. Okay. We also changed, and this addresses a long-standing concern by some of the water suppliers. The State Water Resources Plan was what was talked about in terms of the original legislation, and that was really about taking these future demands, evaluating them against the statutorily protected beneficial uses, and then managing expectations about what the impacts to those protected beneficial uses might be from achieving the water withdrawals that they hope to do 40 years from now. So that's why it was called Water Resources Plan, but as a result of the RAP process, we did agree on a name change here, and so that's kind of a minor change, but it was considered to be significant by members of the RAP. Again, revisions throughout that change local to regional in the proper places, and then the what I'll call comfort language related to that. It's hard to get all these localities in a room to agree on anything, and if one of them doesn't play, you can't hold us hostage or accountable state. So there's some comfort language in there. And then throughout the document, there was an interest in clarifying roles and responsibilities for the local governments, the regional planning units, and for DEQ. Part of that vagueness that existed in the original regulation was that it was a regulation of first impression. It was a brand new thing to the Commonwealth, and so there were things that the original RAP left open-ended and vague because they didn't want to give us too much specific authority or add too many specifics, and they wanted to learn from that experience. And so after that experience, everybody had a greater comfort level in adding that specificity. Next slide. So the vast majority of the Regulatory Advisory Panel came to consensus and support the entire package that's before you today. But there were a couple of notable exceptions. And for the record, these individual RAP members did identify their concerns, and that's included in your staff report, about why they could not support or live with the final outcome. Our definition of consensus that we used in the RAP process was that you could live with the outcome of the group's final proposed regulation and you wouldn't work against it outside of the regulatory advisory process. And so the City of Richmond, the Fairfax Water Authority, and Chesterfield County, who was also representing the Virginia Municipal Drinking Water Association, did not feel that they could support everything that was in the draft before you. Next slide. So I'll go into a little bit of detail in terms of what they introduced into the record related to their concerns. Chesterfield County and their primary concern was related to how water supply risks were to be incorporated into the plans, including whether risks are incorporated as part of an alternatives analysis, and they were requesting that there be more clarity in the regulation on specifics like whether demand projections with or without water conservation are actually used to determine the deficit. As a staff person, it's really challenging when you're dealing with a statewide program that has a vast continuum of capability and capacity. Dealing with an individual town and dealing with Fairfax Water represents a significant difference in terms of how these things are developed on the local level. And so our preference is to address some of that specificity through guidance. And so that was our proposal. We actually developed, in conjunction with the RAP, a list of all of the things that needed to be included in guidance. And so that's how we proposed to address it. We got as specific as we thought we could in the regulation, but that was the basis of the disagreement with that particular individual. Fairfax Water, their concerns are related to department involvement in convening the planning process. And they're also concerned about whether or not there are enough alternatives for a system like theirs that has a long tradition of planning with their regional partners across the river and the Potomac, and that there wasn't enough deference, I think is probably the right way to characterize it, to those efforts in the regulation. DEQ staff feels the work that they've been doing checks many of the boxes, but there are some other things that we don't think they check as well, and we would like them to expand that list of issues in their planning. They didn't like the base level of water supply risks, and they were concerned about some clarification, some specificity related to the guidance that wasn't provided. The City of Richmond, their primary concern was related to the inclusion of Louisa County in one of the James River regions that's directly upstream from them. Their basis for that was that while they may withdraw from the James River, they discharge a significant amount into the York Basin. Our view is that that's true with many of the jurisdictions, including the City of Richmond, and that what we really want is to look at that loss of volume and to plan together to address those issues and be cognizant of your neighbors and how things get impacted downstream. And then the final concern that they had related to, again, whether or not they should be looking at in-stream flow. And our view on that is that's a significant element in terms of the efficiency of the water withdrawal permitting process for surface water. And, for lack of a better term, planned ignorance doesn't help eliminate that from being a problem later on. And so that's the type of thing that we want them to start to learn to have a conversation about. And DEQ has committed to providing the data necessary for them to do that. And so we agreed to disagree in that item. So those are the concerns that were raised. And we tried on a number of different occasions to resolve them, but were unsuccessful. So we agreed to disagree and have moved this forward to you for your review today. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Are there any questions for Scott? Ryan?
Mr. Cullis, thank you much for that presentation. I just had a kind of a quick technical question. On the issue of kind of the identification of specific risks that need to be considered in the development of these plans, do you expect that the final plans would address each of those identified risks, or is it something they just have to consider, and if they choose not to recommend it, kind of an answer to those risks? Kind of, is it a consideration, meaning they have to address each, or is it a consideration meaning they have to think about it, and if they choose to not to address it?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And so our hope is that they will consider it and have a response, a meaningful response about, and it can be graduated, right, about how they see addressing it within that planning period, which is a substantial period of time. It's a 40-year window. So that's what we hope. Though I think with the language that's in front of you, there is the ability for them to say, we considered it, but we didn't believe it was a significant enough risk so that we didn't address it. The way in which we compromised on that was that we indicated to them, and we will have this in the guidance, the expectation is that if they choose not to, they need to provide a rationale for the record about why they didn't.
Any other questions? Scott?
Yeah, thank you. Scott, that was an excellent presentation, and clearly a lot of work went into it. And I realize that when you draw lines on a map, it's very difficult to make everybody happy.
Yes.
In fact, it's probably impossible. So that having been said, with the exception of the City of Richmond's issues with Louisa County, do you have any reason to believe that we or Mike are going to be hearing from mayors or chairman of board of supervisors who think they were stuck in the wrong planning district, or does it not rise to that level of discomfort?
Well, I'm hopeful that you won't, but it's always possible. We did take unprecedented efforts to make sure that everybody was aware, and that awareness will be continued to be developed throughout the remaining process related to the regulation. We also did take steps to ensure that these regions were identified in the Virginia Municipal League and the Virginia Association of County newsletters to try to get the word out and to try to solicit negative feedback. And we did not receive much, so we're hopeful that you will not hear from those folks in a negative way. And I think a lot of the angst was alleviated by that piece of legislation that passed last time. So there is a process, if they're really concerned about where they're placed, for them to make an argument to DEQ why they should go in a different region. So I think that really helped.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Scott? We can
Okay, well, then I'll proceed to staff recommendation. Next slide. Madam Chair, we have received the AG's authorization or certification that we have the authority to proceed with this. The staff recommend that the State Water Control Board approve the proposed amendments to 9 VAC 25-780 and authorize staff to proceed to notice of public comment, if I can get that out.
Any questions with regard to staff recommendation? There being none, may I have a motion, please?
Madam Chair, I move to accept the staff recommendations as presented.
Motion's been made by Mr. Seeger. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. All those opposed, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think our lunch is probably here, so this looks like a good time in the agenda to take a break for lunch. What's the flavor of the board? About 30 minutes, 45 minutes? 30? 40 minutes? 30's fine? Okay, we'll do a 30-minute break. We will reconvene at 12:55. Maybe 1 o'clock, but 12:55. Might be actually 12:50, maybe 1 o'clock before I actually bang the gavel.
Call the June 22nd, 2022 meeting of the State Water Control Board back from recess. The next item on our agenda is receipt of significant noncompliance report and Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act program notices of violations. Mr. Golden. Hi, James.
Madam Chair, members of the board, good afternoon. My name is James Golden. I'm Director of Central Operations at DEQ and currently the Acting Director of Enforcement at DEQ, which is why I'm giving you this report this afternoon. And I'm happy to say, since your last board meeting, we have had no facilities enter significant noncompliance, and there have been no notices of violation issued to localities under the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act.
Thank you. It's always nice to, yay. The next item on the agenda is consent, make sure I got it right, consent special order, LVL Data Center and HTT Contracting, Inc. Mr. Brooks, nice to see you.
Same here.
Could I just say one thing? Jerome now is the director of our Piedmont office, so he just got promoted. So
Fantastic.
congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well deserved.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
He left you. He didn't
Never
go far,
leave
though.
Melanie.
What,
Never
downtown
leave
to
Melanie.
Short Pump area? You know.
So good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the State Water Control Board. As Dr. Director Roban has stated, I am the Regional Director for the Piedmont office. Today I will present two consent orders to the board. HIT Contracting Incorporated, LVL Data Center, and Waste Management of Virginia Incorporated, Charles City County Landfill. Both enforcement actions involve the Piedmont region. I believe you now have all the materials in your board book to both orders. I will move forward with presenting a summary of the two orders together unless the board would prefer to consider and vote on each one separately. Any preference?
Any preference? I think we can take them together.
Okay. HIT Contracting Incorporated, LVL Data Center. This consent order addresses construction stormwater violations which led to the discharge of sediment to approximately 1,750 linear feet of stream. It includes a civil charge of $56,950. All corrective actions have been completed. The public comment period has closed and no comment was received. Waste Management of Virginia Incorporated, Charles City County Landfill. This consent order addresses construction stormwater violations which led to the discharge of sediment to approximately 5.5 acres of wetlands and approximately 4,700 linear feet of stream. All corrective actions have been completed. It includes a civil charge of $95,000. $85,500 of the civil charge will be offset through a completion of a supplemental environmental project, a SEPT. The SEPT funding will be used by the VCU Rice River Center to delineate and characterize tidal wetlands owned by the Chickahominy tribe for the protection of critical habitats for Atlantic sturgeons and bald eagles. It will also develop and implement science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, and technical training opportunities for the tribal citizens so that the tribe can continue the long-term monitoring of the resource. The public comment period was closed and no comments were received. Any questions?
Any questions for Jerome?
LV Data Center. It appears that they continue to have the same kind of issue after one after another. Didn't they take and look at the facility after the first one or two in a great detail to find the rest of them? Or what happened with that? It's kind of strange. This keeps happening.
Yeah, I would think so. As good stewards, I will tell you the compliance efforts will continue with DEQ to monitor that, but you would hope that within their own organization they would actually look and see what corrective actions they can make to stop the recalcitrant behavior.
And then we have to have a motion, right, to accept the consent order?
Well, I'm going to read you the
You gonna read it to me? Okay.
recommendation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any more questions for Jerome?
Melissa, I'm sorry.
Board members, there is a revised M in your board book. I put it in there at lunch. It's a stapled copy. There was a copying error in the version that was originally mailed to you, but what you now have is a full copy.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerome. You may proceed.
Thank you. DEQ recommends that the board approve the consent orders for HIT Contracting Incorporated and Waste Management of Virginia, authorize DEQ's director to execute the consent orders on the behalf of the board, and authorize the director to refer violations of the consent orders to the Office of the Attorney General for appropriate legal action.
Any questions regarding staff recommendation? May I have a motion?
Madam Chair, I make a
Mr.
motion
Seeger.
to accept the recommendations of staff as presented.
Thank you. The motion's been made by Mr. Seeger. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Cameron, thank you. All those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, motion carries. Thank you. All right, I think we move on to other business. Tab N of your board books, Guidelines for Stormwater Local Assistance Fund Program. Mr. Link.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the board. I'm Matthew Link, the SLAP program lead for DEQ, and I'm here to present the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund Program guidelines revisions for your approval. Next slide, please. DEQ has operated the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, or the SLAF program, since 2013 to reduce non-point source pollution from stormwater runoff through the issuance of matching grants to local governments for the implementation of stormwater best management practices. These grants play a key role in meeting local commitments to water quality improvements. During the General Assembly's first special session in 2021, sections of the Code of Virginia pertaining to the SLAF were amended. As a result, DEQ has revised the program guidelines, which delineate how the SLAF funds are distributed, in order to incorporate these changes and make improvements to the program. In order, next slide, please. In order to be consistent with changes to the code, the guidelines now allow for a matching grant percentage of greater than 50% for localities that are considered to have high or above average fiscal stress. Additionally, the guidelines now incorporate total nitrogen reductions into the scoring criteria for grant awards. In addition to the guideline changes prompted by the code amendments, the following revisions are also proposed in the draft guidelines to make improvements to the program. We are allowing the electronic submittal of reimbursement requests. We are incorporating the 2021 Unified Stream Restoration Guide. We are making revisions to the readiness to proceed category of priority ranking criteria to reward all steps in project planning and any steps taken for public engagements in this process. We are requiring the collection of site-level data for stream restoration projects, and we are incorporating the list of proprietary best management practices by reference to allow new practices to be funded. Next slide, please. During the process of drafting revisions, we conducted stakeholder engagement and held a formal public comment period. We held 6 meetings over 2 months with identified stakeholders, including the Virginia Municipal Stormwater Association, the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the James River Association, and representatives from local governments. During the stakeholder engagement process, there were multiple opportunities for those interested in the program to weigh in and provide comment on the proposed revisions. Through this process, we refined the draft guidelines to incorporate this feedback. Next slide, please. After wrapping up stakeholder engagement, we posted the draft guidelines for public comment from April 18th to May 18th, 2021, and a total of 5 communications were received. All commenters provided positive feedback on the stakeholder engagement process. We made one change to the date of a reference document
that was made in response to comment, and all other comments received had been previously addressed during the stakeholder engagement process. I can now take any questions.
Any questions for Matthew? There being none?
Can we move on to the staff recommendation?
Staff recommendation, yeah, please.
Our recommendation is to approve the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund guidelines as written.
Any questions with regard to staff recommendation? There being none, may I have a motion?
Madam Chairman, I move we adopt the staff recommendation as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. I will second that motion. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, other business. Future meetings.
Yes, Madam Chair, the next meeting is scheduled for August 25th, 2022. And following that, the next meeting is scheduled for November 29th, 2022. And Director Roldan wanted to discuss a few issues with you concerning staffing.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. I've talked to most of the members about this one-on-one, but what I'd like to propose is starting at our next meeting to try to reduce the number of staff that participate in these meetings a little bit, just because we don't have the enforcement actions and the permit actions in the future, and we're looking at staffing shortages. So we sometimes have as many as 25 to 35 people involved, and what we'll do is cut that down a little bit, kind of experimentally, make sure that we can answer the questions. We'll have people available by phone, God forbid if we don't know, but hopefully the people that we send will be the right people to answer any questions.
Okay. Yeah, I've been thinking about this too for a little bit of time, and I wonder if there's an opportunity as well to maybe look at how much paper and presentation goes on ahead of these meetings. You know, we get a really informative staff report, and then we get all of the backup information behind that. And I just kind of wonder if we could save a little bit of paper, save a little bit of shipping costs. If perhaps maybe we could have maybe it's staff recommendation, and it's a draft PowerPoint deck behind it. I think that would give us an opportunity to maybe read through this ahead of time a little bit better, put questions down that we have, and you know, have the board be more engaged. But it's just it's something I just wanted to put forward too with regard to that. If there's a way we can look at how to
I mean, I like the idea.
streamline some of this a little bit.
If we could reduce the amount of paper, go to more electronic, maybe just have the summaries in paper, and then send you an email with a link that has all the backup if you want it digitally, that would save a tremendous amount of time and money.
Yeah, and I think even if I'm thinking about staff too, they have to write the memo, then
Yeah.
they have to write the deck.
If we could eliminate a lot of that memo too, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, the memos I noticed this time were fairly short.
Yeah.
And those, I tend to read the memo and then go look if I want to look further. But, you know, I think too, I was just trying to think, well, how could you have it so they don't have to write a memo and a deck, but maybe they get the deck done ahead of time or something like that.
I'll suggest that our staff work on experimenting with ways to save time and money, and maybe at the next meeting, see what you think and give us comments.
Yeah, and I didn't know too if there might be an opportunity, if to have staff available. I don't know. We have all kinds of technology when it works, but if there's a way, maybe there's a Teams link or something, and the board is on one piece of Teams, and the other people that maybe need it are sort of standing by if they need to be, can be virtually, if necessary.
One thing I've learned in 5 months is we're technology challenged.
Yeah.
But we are trying to get a video conference system set up. Is a lot of issues with Vita and pipe and capacity, but we're working on it. That's definitely another, I mean,
Yeah.
Having spent my time in the private sector, I'm just appalled at how backwards we are. So we're going to work on it. We just have a funding issue, and that's part of the whole staffing problem. I mean, we have you know, the 5% raise is coming, but the general revenue is only 38.5% of our budget. So the other amount of the budget has to come from fees or federal funds, which are not going up. So now we're going to have to not fill some positions to be able to pay for the raise for everybody. So we're just really getting eaten up money-wise. So anything we do to make things more efficient will help us perform better. So we'll work on it. And anyone else on the board, any ideas, we're open. And Melissa and Jill and Rachel will
Yeah,
gladly.
any ideas? You know, I will say that I enjoy, part of what I enjoy about this role as a board member is the interaction that I do get with staff from time to time, and I think there's opportunity. I know when I worked in state service, it was nice to have the opportunity as a younger staff member or junior staff member to have that opportunity to present before the board and get that experience. So I would like to say that I'd still like to see that, have people present their projects and positions.
I guess my only comment is, I don't want the majority of stuff to be electronic, because I like to be able to make notes on it, highlight stuff, and have it at the meeting. And if it's all electronic, that goes up. So there's going to be a balance somewhere.
So I'm a paper person too, so I understand.
Well, I don't say I'm all paper, but.
No, I know. So what we might want to do is kind of customize for each person. Because I watched Rachel and Jill and Melissa make all these copies, and mail them in advance, and it's a major production. It's deja vu 25 years ago doing reports. But what we might be able to do is, customize it. In the private sector, we did that for our clients. Some clients wanted 3 copies, hard copies, some wanted 1, some wanted 12, some wanted 22. We give them what they want, and then plus electronic, so we could tailor it to the person. But we definitely have to figure out ways to become more efficient.
Yep.
I appreciate everyone's support.
I think, being able to have the appendices to a lot of things in a link that I can click on.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's just easier to be able to search exactly what I'm looking for too, as opposed to trying to read through all the different pages, especially in the public comments and things like that. Okay. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the Mountain Valley Pipeline update.
So I'll recuse myself and wait in the hallway.
Please note for the record that Mr. Rolban has left the meeting.
Madam Chairman, may I?
Yes.
Members of the board, this is our report to you on the status of the Mountain Valley Pipeline for the period March 19th through June.
Hold mic to you.
Through June 15th. Is it on?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
on.
Perfect.
It has to be really it has to be right there.
So at this time, MVP still lacks federal approvals to work in the Jefferson National Forest and to cross streams and wetlands. With much of the pipeline already installed in upland areas where work has been and is permitted, the project is presently not moving forward, so there is no new forward construction to update you on. However, since the project is still in that interim construction nature, of course, they have to inspect and maintain all their erosion and sediment control measures across the project. So at this time, most of the activity on the project is limited to that inspection and maintenance of erosion and sediment control measures. Apparently, some small areas have been disturbed since the last board meeting, so they could install cathodic protection anode beds. For that, they're part of an operating pipeline, so they're installing those beds. And then additionally, in watching the temporary stabilization of the right-of-way, they have been basically cutting and removing invasive species, volunteer woody plants. They're keeping that unnecessary vegetation off the right-of-way. DEQ and our third-party contractors do continue daily inspections. We had 2 issues that were reported to our pollution response program. One involved a fire on the right-of-way, but it was not related to any project activity. However, MVP did need to go in and replace some erosion and control measures after that. I want to say it was a recreational, a trail, I can't think of the word, that got caught on fire, but that was not related to any activity on the site. And then there was also a complaint about runoff eroding a garden plot that had been recently plowed near the pipeline. And we did inspect both of those incidents, and they were not the result of project noncompliance. So that's it.
Any questions for Melanie? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I believe it's time for our public forum. Melissa, I believe we have one speaker.
Yes, we do. We have Jessica Sims with Appalachian Voices, who would like to speak about gold mining.
Thank you.
And she has up to 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Sims. I'm here today on behalf of Appalachian Voices, and welcome to the new members of the board. And thanks for all the work all of you are doing. Just want to revisit an issue some of y'all are familiar with, but it may be new to others, and that's the potential threat of large-scale gold mining and metals mining, including copper, zinc, and lead within the Commonwealth. We found that close to the now canceled ACP route in Buckingham County, a Canadian prospecting company had been coming to the county for 6 years, and doing exploratory drilling, which does not require notifying county right now. The company, Aston Bay, has purposefully selected Virginia as the location for potential new drilling and mining sites, specifically, as they have publicly stated, because we have no regulations for the industry. So sort of an open market to them, and so that's of grave concern to anyone who would live in any of the communities that could be impacted by this industry. I'll mention too, Virginia has hundreds of abandoned gold mines that are unreclaimed, some unreclaimed and some leaking mercury. There'd been recent news coverage about mercury pollution in the Rapidan River from a gold mining site near that. So we have a history of the industry, but not to this scale. So I just want to flag these for you, and Ms. Harrell is forwarding some information about current public opportunities to learn about the issue and to participate. So my suggestion is that y'all consider submitting a comment or even reviewing this information after the processes started by HB 2213, which require a study of the industry and its impacts. That's been split into 2 pieces. The National Academy of Sciences is doing a review of current processes, and a state agency committee made of stakeholders is doing the other half to look at environmental justice. And so we're really in the throes of them taking comments and creating their reports now. So I want to flag that the NAS comment period is going to close in July. So what you'll receive forwarded to you are links to some of this information, and there is a state agency committee meeting as soon as tomorrow if you have the capacity to tune in virtually or you happen to be in Buckingham. Really just to express to y'all, this is of major concern to those along the belt, which goes from Fairfax to Halifax, or anyone downstream, because modern gold mining processes use cyanide. And so for the millions that are within the James River watershed, that's not an industry that we want to have as a potential threat to the James River. So yeah, I want to flag that the state agency committee is taking comments until September 30th. They will take those kind of combined reports and send the information and their findings to the Department of Energy. So just wanted to flag that for y'all, and appreciate, any future opportunities to comment or for y'all to receive public comment on issues that are currently prohibited, if that opportunity were to come up for future meetings. And that's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate that information. Any others out in the audience wishing to address the board? There being none, I will go ahead and adjourn our meeting today. June 22nd meeting of the State Water Control Board is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody. See you in August. Oh yeah, Mike can come back. Whoops, we forgot to invite Mike back.